I'm Isabella and you're listening to Zeno. Each month I have conversations with people from all walks of life about their personal stories of home, identity and the search for belonging. Welcome to the show, Sam Johnson-Schlee. It's wonderful to have you here. I'm excited to delve into your work, Living Rooms. How do you describe yourself and the work that you do?
I'm an academic and a writer, and those two things do intertwine a lot in my work. And sometimes I think I'm heading in one direction as an academic and a different direction as a writer, but end up looping back and finding ways to join those things together again. As a writer, the thing that I'm interested in is in the everyday and in the objects around us and familiar environments. And the thing that I want to do with my readers is always try and give them new ways of coming back and looking at the things around them and that kind of critical distance or estrangement from things which can be so provocative.
And your book, Living Rooms, you blend so many things together. You blend political discourse, psychogeography as well in a way, and your own story and memoir, because you dedicate the collection of essays to Galvey, which I understand is your grandparents' home. What does home taste, sound, smell and feel like for you?
The thing that's reflected in the book is how much that particular home shaped my experience of what home is like. And I was very lucky, I'm very privileged in many ways, and to be able to live in that home was a great privilege. And it was a place that was full of smells and things which maybe people don't associate with a sort of well-organised domestic space. Smelt a lot of oil paint and turpentine because my grandfather was a painter, but also dust and cats and things like that. And that sense of chaos was part of what made it such a place that was accommodating to a child. I think particularly in that point in my life when I was 7, 8, 9, you're living in such a world of overheated chaos that to live in a place that isn't putting too much structure around you was quite exciting and a good place to be. It all sounds so romantic, and I suppose it is in some ways. My grandfather plays the piano and he'd play it every day, and it was quite out of tune, so he's quite a good pianist, but he played the same songs again and again. Lady Be Good was a common one, lots of jazz standards. Taste, had a lot of cauliflower cheese. I was a vegetarian and I had to teach myself to cook because people always pretended they forgot I was a vegetarian, so I'd have to cook fried eggs for myself at the last minute for every meal. Just was a good training.
I think I'd love to start with a short reading.
A house is presented as a righteous reward for the hard work of the person that owns it. This is an illusion that allows us to forget that the work of the labourers who built the house was not rewarded in proportion to the value it produced for the developer. You try to find a place to recover from life under capitalism, only to end up in a shell made of a stranger's exploitation. What else is there to do inside the home but to try to pretend that we do not live in such a bind? The things that we surround ourselves with are the props and scenery for a fantasy, the dream of a world beyond the conditions of everyday life. Floral fabrics mean we are never separated from nature. Sofas create a state of superposition between life and death. Picture frames are portals to the people and places from which we are separated. Pot plants embody the will of life to exceed its container. Woven materials hold us in a permanent embrace, as if we were loved. And altogether we may read the interior for what it is, a dream of a world beyond the limits of commodity. Our sleeping dreams are made from fragments and memories drawn from our daily lives, what Freud calls the residues of the day, which provide comfort and enclosure for our sleeping mind. Though we may struggle to identify the meaning that lies behind their arrangements, we furnish our homes with similar fragments. But while on one hand, our homes may appear to say something about ourselves, for the most part, they're made up of commodities made of other people's labour. Where our dreams are made from pieces of our own life, our homes are fantasies made from pieces of other people's lives. Like dreams, homes can be read as a kind of displacement. We create a place of relative isolation, but we do so through the ownership of commodities. In this way, we weave ourselves into a web of social relations that extends across the world. It is easy to see in a child's drawing. You stick it on your wall to hold that person symbolically close to you. It is harder to see the same desire for intimacy in the furniture we buy to comfort our bodies. But I think that it is there, and that we might see it if we interpret the living room as if it were a dream.
There's so many things to pull apart. This sense of escape. I thought a lot about chinoiserie and how often the wealthy would create these pleasure palaces, and they would be this manner to escape from the so-called pressures of their courtly lives. And it begs the question of who is given the ability to escape, who is allowed that sense of luxury. And I think you so beautifully navigate the urgent political questions we're dealing with now in terms of the rental market, late stage capitalism, but also what it says about the more darker sides of human history. And I'm wondering practically, how has your sense of homemaking and your political views about the home and the interior, how has that changed for you since writing the book?
In one sense, it hasn't, because like everyone else, I'm trying to live. And I think something that is important to me is not to suggest that we can change the way we consume things in our homes as a kind of act of political transformation. I mean, there are things that we can do. We can all make decisions for ourselves ethically and morally that make us feel better or worse about the way we live our lives. And I'm not saying that isn't the case. But in the end, we're all trying to find a way to survive in a world which is hostile to everyone and more hostile to some people than others. You know, I'm a middle-class white man, and I do not experience the same hostility in the world that many other people do because of the privilege that comes with that identity. But nevertheless, home for me is a place that is a necessary escape. And I'm very fortunate that I have a home that can be that for me. And lots of the things that I write about in the book, you know, sometimes I tried quite hard in the book not to be judgmental or try and offer a count of taste or in a kind of Bourdieuian sense. I wanted to write about things in a way that would allow, I hope, as wide an audience as possible to relate that to their own experience. So I don't think my book is a guide about how to furnish your home or how to live in your home. But what I hope it is a provocation to read the things you're already doing as having a political content, and to see that in the way that we kind of furnish our homes to, you know, as an act of survival, the way we live, we might actually be trying to kind of already architecting an alternative way of living. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I have changed the way I live in particular, but I do think it was helpful for me to think through and try and define some of the things that I am thinking about always when I make decisions in the home.
You helpfully and poignantly illustrate the political nature of how we can find home in a very hostile system. And, you know, I'm interested in this idea of what would a more collective sense of home building look like. Sophie Lewis at Abolish the Family talks about over-privatisation of the family and the home, and how clearly it's just not working for us anymore. What in this space gives you hope?
I think the mention of Sophie Lewis is a good one there, because I find those books incredibly hopeful. I found Sophie Lewis's work very challenging and inspirational to me, and in the way that some of the best writing does, it's sort of shaken me out of some of my assumptions, the things that maybe you don't notice that you're living with, and I say that as a person that's like lives in some ways a pretty ordinary life, have a wife and about to have a baby, but Sophie Lewis's work has really helped me think about what that really means and really how little it means, because those associations and assemblages and different sets of relationships that we make in our lives in order to survive could take any form. And I really like that aspect of the notion of abolishing the family. Yeah, I found her work very useful in that way, and particularly like some of the ways she works through figures like Alexander Kollontai, the radical Soviet revolutionary feminist who, among other things, proposed a city without kitchens where domestic labour would be collectivised in various ways. I think you might remember the big hoo-ha on Twitter a couple of years ago when, I wish I could remember his actual name because I can only remember his handle, but Arbeitfish wrote a tweet about abolishing restaurants that made a lot of people really upset. But I think the idea that cooking, laundry, domestic labour have always been the works of private family units is such a construction of, well, the post-war, but even more recently than that, it's not a given in the way that we assume it is. And I think sometimes by looking back, not just at people like Alexander Kollontai, but also cafes and pubs and greasy spoons, you can see what other kinds of world is possible. And really one of the people that I think is one of the great thinkers around is Edwina Attlee, who wrote a beautiful book called Strayed Homes, which is all about those spaces like greasy spoons and cafes and pubs, which she talks about as domestic space outside of the home. And I think we can unsettle those boundaries. And I think in trying to kind of highlight the relational nature of dwelling and living and life, I guess what I want to say is that what you might think of as a private enclosed space is actually already much more unsettled than you think on surface value. Another person who I've spoken to recently about this is the architect Mariana Yanovich, who is involved. It was one of the V&A, I can't remember the exact title, I think designers in residence of some kind last year. And she did this unbelievably beautiful project about laundry. I think it was called 1001 Drying Rooms. And there's a nice publication about it called Islands. And she has talked a lot about the lost collective spaces around laundry that have created some of the situations with damp and mould that have had very tragic consequences in some cases in our country today. So I think the hope for a more collective kind of arrangement in terms of social reproduction, it's not actually as hard to glimpse as we might assume. The edifice of capital and the edifice of the private home and the kind of idea that we are a moaning democracy is monumental culturally, but actually it's much more vulnerable than it lets on its face.
Mm. You would hope it would happen in a third space, that we'd be having these conversations outside of the privatized home. And it's interesting, this thinking about like laundry as a very salient example. In moving something like that into a privatized space, then are you almost creating this more superficial presentation of yourself? You're avoiding this idea that we're actually all messy and we have to just iron our shirts and be ready for work on Monday. It picks away at that surface level mask. And you touch on this as well in Living Rooms, looking at Freud and his interpretation of it. What deeper narratives for you are hidden in our interior spaces that you find really gripping?
The great kind of tension at the heart of my book, and the thing that I'm trying to unpick, but during COVID, during the pandemic, I had this like intense feeling of wanting to be outside, but not wanting to be outside. I think I put it really nicely in the book, but I can't remember what I say. But it's this thing of like, I don't want to go outside, I want to be outside. Or I don't want to be at home, I don't want to go outside. I think I said something about this on Twitter when we were all spending too much time on social media, and someone said, have you tried putting your head out the window? Which I think was a really actually a really nice thought. I found it really useful in that moment, because there is a sense in which the home is a sanctuary but also a trap, and that's the theoretical thing here. So Walter Benjamin, the great Frankfurt School critical theorist, to whom my book is utterly indebted, this was his analysis of the interior of the 19th century, that the home is at once a fortification and a trap. And it's that doubleness, that tension between sanctuary and constraint, that I think is the heart of what is the political drama that's going on in the home, in that it's a space to survive in a world that is hard to survive in. It's a space that is not accessible to everyone, and it's a space that's not secure for everyone. I mean, I think that's important to say as well, and maybe not something that comes across well enough in the book, is that for many people, particularly women, home is a very dangerous place to be. The drama about kind of trying to cut yourself away out of the world that is making your life so difficult, and yet having that escape, that separate space, is such a privilege, and a privilege that is only afforded by allowing yourself to either be exploited or to exploit other people in the workplace and in industry.
You have a whole essay on houseplants in particular, which I found really moving, and reflecting on how this trend of filling our homes with living things and houseplants, that's a way of us creating more of an ecosystem, like a different way of being in the world, a different way of living, which I thought was wonderful. What are you exploring creatively at the moment?
Well, I'm working on a book about heating and gas, central heating, which is going to be called Hot House, and hopefully be published by Faber in 2025. Wow. In that book, I want to talk about the way we heat our homes and create comfort in our homes is this neglected aspect of both material and social architecture of our domestic lives. I think it's easy to overlook the extent to which atmospheric conditions in our homes shape the way that we're able to occupy them. The acute example of it that many of us experienced in recent winters and in this winter is the cost of living crisis. That means that many people are not heating their homes as much as allows them to be comfortable, and as much as actually is good for the home, because heat is quite important to manage damp and things in the home. But many of us in the last few years, perhaps for the first time, have felt uncomfortable in our homes and experienced things which for many poorer people has been a normal part of winter. And obviously for those people, it's been even more acute. And there have been a larger number of deaths caused by cold in the winter, and it has had a real material effect on people's lives. I'm engaged with heat in that sense, and it does have this life or death aspect, heat, both the life and death of our homes and the life and death of the people that live in them. I'm really interested in the relationship between heat and culture, so the way that we spend time in our homes. So in 1961, the Parker Morris Committee, which was a committee designed to set the standards for social housing in Britain, determined, it's often talked about as a set of measures to establish space standards, so how much space a home should have. Standards, I should say, which no longer apply, but helped build a kind of generation of high quality housing. But second to space is heat. So they determined in these standards that there should be living spaces should be able to be heated all the time to 18 degrees centigrade in temperatures as low as -1. And they said that one of the reasons for this was to create private, quiet spaces for people to work, because particularly poorer people were often only keeping, but even, many people were only really heating 1 or 2 rooms in their homes in the winter. And they said in this report that meant that even in the rest of the year, people still didn't use their bedrooms for things like socializing, reading, consuming culture, privacy. So the teenager's bedroom, the whole freedom that bedrooms present to teenagers that are lucky enough to have privacy in their bedrooms, is only really possible because of heat. And that's just one of the many ways that our lives have been shaped by that. So this is really preoccupying me at the moment.
It's fascinating. Something that's coming up for me when you talk about that is philosophical approaches in terms of philosophy of mind, and Merleau-Ponty is such an important insight to have, like how heating your home does impact your youth culture, you could say.
Yeah, I really like that, actually. I hadn't really thought about thinking about Merleau-Ponty in this context, but the nice thing that he talks about is to remind us that we're made of the same stuff that we are sensing. So there is less of a clear boundary between our bodies and the things that our bodies sense. We're all involved in the same kind of murky medium of existence. And homes are a great example of that. And I think the thing that what you say that's really provocative and interesting to me is that you can think about heat and the atmosphere as a medium for being in space, like a kind of soupy quality of being. And I think that's what I'm really interested in at the moment, is developing some clearer language about atmosphere. We're not very good at talking about atmosphere, aside from that like trend for talking about hygge a few years ago, or ideas like coziness. We don't have good language for describing what it feels like to be in a space.
Yeah, completely. And I think the lens that you're working with is really interesting in terms of post-naturalism, the idea of toxicity, when we have to accept that a lot of our lived spaces have toxic elements in it, like, and that will affect our lived experience.
Yeah, there's a great book out recently by Jay Owens called Dust, and one of the things that she talks about is the kind of toxicity of particulate pollution in the home. And for instance, I understand from talking to Jay that using your toaster produces incredibly carcinogenic internal pollution. Now, I'm not advocating the end of toast because I really like toast, but I don't think we always, we don't necessarily have a good way of accounting for exactly what you say, that the complex effects of our environment on the way we live. Yeah, there's quite a funny Guardian piece some point last year by George Monbiot, which was like, the article was something like, I thought I was doing the right thing by putting a wood-burning stove in my house, but now I realise it was the wrong thing. And it is a really weird idea that there was this middle-class obsession that was sort of justified by environmentalism, that we should just bring the burning stuff into our house. Instead of burning things in power plants, we burn them in our homes less efficiently. It should have always seemed like madness.
That does also speak to the constantly orienting fact of what it's like to try and feel at home and feel comfortable in the system.
Yeah. And I guess that is the, wood burning stoves, hygge, all of these things, slankets. Remember slankets? All of these things are measures that people are taking to find that kind of comfort and home. And I guess a lot of people make those decisions probably with the understanding that might not be very good for them, or might not be very good for the environment, or might not be very good for society, because there is a kind of survival thing going on.
I loved how you interwove memoir and your personal experience of your grandparents' home. And I'd love to know, what objects would you have in your museum of belonging?
A sofa. I feel bad because I'm always talking about my grandparents' house, and I do fear it is a bit conceited, but there's this beautiful sofa that was destroyed in a fire when my grandparents' house burnt down, but has subsequently been reconstructed, like the $1 Million Man or whoever it was. And my grandfather found it by putting an advert in the newspaper which read, "Wanted, 7-foot sofa for a 6-foot loafer." And it is so comfortable to me and so reassuring. And the fact that it was one of the first things that moved into their new house when it was rebuilt after the fire made it feel immediately like the same house. So that is the icon of home for me personally. My book is full of objects like this. And I guess if I was making a museum, I would probably not put my things into it, because despite what it may seem like, I'm not trying to hold myself up as a model for anything. Quilts. I write a lot about quilts in the book. Again, it's something that's part of my life, but also quilts from places like Gee's Bend in Alabama are these kind of incredible objects, testaments of survival and the use and reuse of objects and the connections that people make between each other. And yeah, I'll add houseplants as well. I mean, I think I'm a good Marxist and everything is about the dialectic for me, but the houseplant as this object which is both constrained and trying to live within its constraints is a powerful metaphor for the way that most of us live in our society. And when you're renting, that is what it feels like. It's like you are a houseplant. You have to be ready to move forever. You can never put down roots, but you have to pretend that you're beautiful and happy at all times.
And you have that line is like, I think it was something around, is this all that we were given? Or I know I'm misremembering it, but you ask a really poignant question about, is this justified? Can we look beyond our existing limitations and the commodification of the home? That's
one of the things that I guess I want to do with my book is that I want, even people that are able to live in very privileged situations feel comfortable in their homes. Like, that is not a model for society, because the fact that you, as the person sitting at home listening to this and thinking, my house is pretty nice, the fact that you can live like that is certainly based on the fact that somebody else can't live like that. And your comfort only exists because somebody else is denied comfort. And I think by challenging us to estrange ourselves and critically engage with not just bad living conditions, but good living conditions, I think hopefully that can provoke people to seek or have higher standards, have better expectations for what our society can be. And I guess I want to caveat with the fact that that is a really hard thing to do, because it's really hard to try and have something different. It's really hard to criticize the things that you rely on. There's an Austrian writer I like called Thomas Bernhard, and apparently in his lifetime in Austria he was called a Nestverschmutzer, which means something like somebody that shits in his own nest, because he was so critical about Austria. I like that phrase because you shouldn't talk badly about the things that give you your position in society or give you your privilege. Actually, I think we need to learn how to do that sometimes. That's a really difficult thing to do. And I think sometimes when we're trying to perform particular modes of political righteousness, it's easy to forget that we are also surviving.
I guess that's the role of acknowledging it and recognizing that there are shared struggles, even if we might be in different class or intersectional experiences. This idea of comfort's really interesting to me. I'm involved in community groups that are thinking a lot about belonging and what the different components are of belonging. And what I'm finding interesting is, comfort, a sense of safety, is an essential ingredient of belonging. But for people who are marginalized, there is this kind of inherent discomfort of being in that position in society. And I think you speak to that so beautifully in the book around the discomfort of rentier capitalism. And I'd love to talk to you about your essay around picture frames and IKEA. And I loved you quoted this anthropologist who talked about the showroom being an aesthetic trap.
Saffron Woodcraft.
There's something so overwhelming about the showroom experience. I'm thinking more of like when you go around IKEA, you can't help, even if you keep your political views at the forefront of your mind, you can't help but be drawn into that experience. How are you thinking about that now in terms of trends within aesthetic culture of the interior?
My wife Rebecca and I she is 7 months pregnant and we are fully in nesting mode, as I'm told that we're supposed to call it. And we walked around IKEA the other day, and it is this engrossing place. And Rebecca, who's also a writer, she's called Rebecca May Johnson. She wrote an essay about IKEA canteens a while ago. So it's a place that we both have a certain intellectual kind of curiosity about and fascination with. But we walked around it and felt somehow like deadened by it. It didn't provide that Disneyland experience, the horrendous feeling of being dragged by those arrows on the floor through IKEA that is both irresistible and horrendous, rewarded only by the meatballs or the hot dog. But like, it was interesting to feel, I think we both felt this kind of refusal or lack of interest or unwillingness to participate in what it was asking us to do that was surprising. And I don't know why that was. Maybe it was to do with change in interests or our life stage, but I think also part of us is maybe a distance that we've developed through our intellectual work as well. I keep seeing these adverts on television for Wayfair, that kind of company that is deliberately setting itself up against IKEA at the moment. So they have these adverts I saw the other day where they had one of those robot hoovers, and they have the hoover miserably hoovering this monotone interior, and it looks so sad. And then it somehow breaks out of its flat and goes down the corridor into another house, which is all brightly coloured and full of Wayfair furniture. And this robot vacuum cleaner looks so happy and joyful. It is interesting, I think, how our culture in general is maybe turning against a particular aesthetic of organisation and control and tightness in search of something else, maybe something a bit more chintzy. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but I think it does tell a story about a dissatisfaction with the home that people are maybe feeling.
Mm. Yeah, it's so funny that your reflections on IKEA. I mean, me and my partner feel exactly the same way. And it's like, well, at least they've got vegan meatballs at the end, they're liberally enlightened enough to offer us vegan meatballs. It's interesting to hear you talk about your having a child and you're thinking about these ideas of family and how that is so intimately connected with the idea of domestic space. What advice would you give to someone who finds themselves unsure of where they belong or how they might make a home?
I wish I had some practical advice, because that's a situation of great vulnerability that I think everyone finds themselves in at some point, but some people find it harder to escape than other people. And there are two ways to answer this. One is to talk about how an individual faces that problem. And one is to think about how society faces that problem. And in some ways, in this imaginary situation, both are kind of unsatisfactory, because you can say it's like those sort of the trope of right-wing politicians shouting at a homeless person and saying, go and get yourself a house. And it's like, well, no, I've tried. I don't know how. I can't do it. Or it's not I don't know how. I do know how, but I can't. I wish I had an easy answer for that, but so often the problem is a structural one. But equally, it's unsatisfying to say to that person, create a municipal wonderland, like transform the society into socialist paradise, because I don't know, that feels like such a hard thing to offer as a solution to anything, as much as it's something that would be good. I don't have a satisfactory answer to your question. It's a difficult one to answer, because I think I would only ever want to be able to offer something that would be real help, and what people need is material help. People in that situation, they don't need idioms or slogans or catchphrases. They need £1,500. Like, they need £10,000. Like, they need money. They need support. They need an address so they can get a job, and they need that advice and help. And that's so hard to come by. When I was doing my PhD research, part of my PhD research, I volunteered at a soup kitchen in South London, and a lot of the people that came in were people that either had very precarious living situations or were homeless or lived in hostels. And there was this woman that I got to be quite friendly with, and every week she would come in. The thing we did at the soup kitchen, aside from eat and drink tea, was play cards. And she said, I'm going to play a few rounds of cards to sharpen myself up before I go and deal with the man. And what she meant by that was she was going to go and see the council and try and sort out her housing situation. And she was made to go into these meetings every week for weeks and weeks to get her housing set up. And the reason for that was because she was a drinker and she wanted to get onto a rehab scheme. But in order to get onto that scheme, she needed to have a secure address. And really, they were kind of expecting that she would change where she lived, because social networks and the people that you have to spend time with are such an obstacle in creating that situation. And she got through it. She went through rehab and she stopped drinking. I have no idea what's happened to her since then. But I'll never forget her sitting next to me after being away for a while. She came back looking a bit different, speaking a bit differently because she wasn't drinking. And I said, what are you going to do later? And she said, well, I suppose I'm going to go home and sit in my house and probably not see anyone because I can't see any of my friends now because they all drink. And I'll just do that. And I'll probably just do that every day now until I die. And I was so struck in that moment by the fact that this woman's security of tenure, this home that she'd fought for, but in that moment it represented this kind of misery, this denial of self. But it speaks to the kind of misery of the way we imagine the home and what we imagine the home to mean and what we imagine it to represent. And sometimes the way we imagine a home in policy and in culture is as a place where you've got a static, isolated, secure position, something that maybe makes sense in a capitalist model of what it is to live. If you're living on the margins, it was kind of a harder place to accommodate yourself to. But I found that it was such a powerful moment for me, and I don't really know how to interpret it fully or how to understand it or what to learn from it. But just this sense of the reminder that the security that she thought she might have in this home, she was very grateful and she was happy not to be drinking, and it opened the possibility of seeing her family and things again. But I think in that moment when she was talking to me, it also felt desperately isolated.
That speaks to that deep sense of isolation that is more and more apparent in this increasingly privatised and commodified world that we live in this chaotic political space for you. Like, what helps you to feel less isolated when you think about home and belonging in that way?
It's such an existential question. It's just making me like gazing into myself, gaze into the abyss and the abyss gazes into you. I think there's always hope in other people, and there's always hope in the networks and connections and solidarity that persists even where we don't think there is any. I mean, solidarity is real. It's real, guys. Solidarity is real. And it does do something. Like in the town where we live, which is a town in the north of Essex, quite a strange and wonderful place. We joined a network there through things like, we volunteer at our local cinema, and we joined our local sailing club, which is not like many sailing clubs. It's a pretty diverse environment, at least diverse for that area. And just that daily connection, that rubbing along, that kind of encounter, it makes everything feel so much better. And I think there's a real political power just in being alongside somebody else, just being in public spaces. And you know what? That is why public space has been so eroded by right-wing political projects, because even if the people contained in a public space are not thinking revolutionary thoughts, fact of being close to other people, I really want to believe it produces a political effect. It sort of summons a new idea of what the public body is, what the social body is. And on some level, I think it acts on us and reminds us of the power of collectivity and solidarity. I think the more public space and the more comfortable spaces that we can find together to do everyday things like laundry, eat, cook, clean ourselves, all of these things, if we could create more spaces like that, I think that's where the hope is, because that's where different possibilities are going to emerge from. And it's no coincidence that those spaces are so under attack.
I couldn't agree more. I think inherent in the public space as well is like thinking about different ways of relating to each other. The atomization of us, the sterilization of what it means to be human, has this really negative impact on how we relate to each other. I was part of a community group of women who have all experienced chronic burnout. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the things that we explored together was this idea of collective rest. Like, what would it be like for us to feel rested together in our shared presence? And it didn't feel radical at the time, but it actually kind of is in a way. How many spaces do we have that facilitate that kind of connection, where you can then say, hey guys, why don't we just just do something restful together wherever we might be, without any worry about social effects of that. And one thing that one person in the group said was she started, as a result of us being in this group, she started just doing chores with her friends. Instead of the usual, oh, let's just get coffee, let's just get dinner. Like, I'll just come to your house and I'll help you clean some things, help you wash some dishes. And something about that feels really hopeful to me.
That's really nice. The idea of collective rest is such a beautiful idea. It's quite moving, because rest is something I think of as the thing that I do by myself. And the people that I rest with are only the people that I'm most intimately, I know most intimately. So it is a powerful idea to think about resting. I mean, it's, we're talking about the home, but the place where I think there's hope to be found is so often, in public space. And I think there's a lot of nonsense about, oh, nobody talks to each other on the train or whatever. I don't want people to talk to me on the train. But there's something just about being there, like seeing someone having a little snooze on the train, or just somebody carrying a big bag, and you think, what are they taking home? Like, these things are so moving and so hopeful if we open our eyes to them, to recognize that we're all trying to do our stuff all in the same place together, and maybe we could make decisions about our society and our political environment that might help everyone, not just us as individuals.
I think that's a beautiful place to end this conversation. And if anybody wants to follow you or find out more about your work, where can they find you? And encouragement for people to buy your book, Living Rooms, where can they find you?
So you can find me on, oh God, it's called X now, isn't it? You can find me on Twitter and on Instagram if you like, if you want to see some sort of weird photos of the Essex coast, SNF-Schlee. And most recently I have a Substack writing about listening to my dad's CDs. He died last year, and I've been listening back to his CDs and trying to learn something about him through doing that. So I've been writing about that recently. Sifting and Sorting. So you're welcome to seek either out. And Living Rooms is published by Peninsula Press, so buy it from your favourite local indie bookshop, or if you're a real fan, go to Burley Fisher, where Peninsula Press is partly based.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a really enjoyable conversation.
Hi friends, thank you so much for listening to Zeno, a podcast which is all about home, identity and the search for belonging. I'm so grateful to be sharing these conversations with you to help build a more nuanced picture of what belonging means in our world today. Our theme music is by Alex Julian Edwards, and our branding is designed by Somewhere Off Grid. If you want to find out more about our upcoming episodes or receive more resources on crafting your sense of home and belonging, you can subscribe to our newsletter at xenocast.org or follow us on Instagram at xeno_pod. I'd really appreciate it if you could share our work with other people, share it with friends who you think might resonate with our message, and rate and comment on our podcast on either Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for your generous attention and for listening to our stories.